James Connolly was an Irish Republican and Socialist revolutionary. However, the circumstances surrounding his death and the appropriation of his legacy by bourgeois nationalists has led to many deliberate misrepresentations of his beliefs and complicated discussions about his political philosophy. Connolly was born on the 5th of June 1868 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was born in an Irish slum in the Cowgate area. His parents were both from Ireland and had moved to Scotland. He attended the local Catholic primary school until the age of around 10, whereupon he left and began working. All the men in his family were labourers. At 14, he lied about his age and joined the British Army under a false name. He was a member of the Royal Scots Regiment in Ireland for nearly 7 years during the period known as the Land War, where tenant farmers and peasants fought a campaign of resistance to the brutal system of landlordism imposed upon them. This experience would have had a deep impact on Connolly, and when he heard his regiment was being transferred to India, he deserted. After leaving the army, he moved back to Edinburgh, married Lily Reynolds, who then became Lily Connolly, and became involved in the Scottish Socialist Federation, or SSF. At the time, there was an important split amongst the Marxist organisations in Britain, and this would have been very apparent to Connolly when the new unionism movement appeared. After the London gas workers and dock workers strikes, labourers began to organise themselves into large, militant general unions, which fought to increase wages and decrease hours. Many dismissed the union struggles as pointless, arguing that the unions simply sought to reform capitalism. William Morris, the founder of the Scottish League, for example, said that Marxists should be focused on making and educating more Marxists, not fighting for reforms. Many of these kinds of intellectual Marxists believed that they simply needed to educate the working class about the economic laws of capitalism and prepare them for the inevitable triumph of socialism. They viewed Marxism as a sort of tautological prophecy, and the end of capitalism as something rapturous that could not be brought about, only anticipated. In 1890, Edinburgh print workers and rail workers went on strike. The Edinburgh branch of the Scottish Socialist Federation sponsored a Labour Day march and used the parade to build up support for the print workers. They also gave full support for the 8-hour day. However, when the rail workers went on strike the year after, they reverted to a position of simple propaganda. They issued a leaflet saying that trade unionism was powerless in its current form. They claimed that one big union for all workers was required, and then a general strike could be organised. The ideas that were being debated at the time would become very important to Connolly's political development, and we shall see the effects of them in Labour and Irish history. After the defeat of New Unionism, the Scottish Labour Party, which later became the Independent Labour Party, or ILP, was founded by Keir Hardie. It was not an explicitly socialist party, instead aiming for practical political reforms. The ILP grew rapidly, and the SSF eventually decided that their members could join and work with the ILP if they wished, but stated that the work of the SSF was education in socialist principles. Connolly became a very eager and well-known member of the ILP. He chaired the very first ILP meeting in Edinburgh, and was one of the delegates sent to a conference in Glasgow. By 1893, he was the secretary of both the Edinburgh ILP and the Edinburgh SSF. This period of Connolly's life really shows the political journey that he went on. The ILP was a very moderate organisation, and yet Connolly would go on to be executed for his role in an armed rebellion against British rule in Ireland. But let's not get ahead of the story. In 1894, while trying to secure the Irish vote for an ILP candidate in Edinburgh, Connolly made several recommendations to Keir Hardie to meet publicly with MPs sympathetic to Irish Home Rule. Keir, however, ignored these suggestions and instead tried to attain an alliance with the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party didn't support Home Rule for Ireland. This totally disillusioned Connolly, and afterwards he resigned all his posts within the ILP and turned sharply left. When he stood for election in the St Giles ward for Edinburgh Corporation, he stood as a socialist candidate, and his approach to electoral politics had also changed. In his book The Politics of James Connolly, Kieran Allen writes, quote, "The elections were no longer purely about returning a Labour representative who could introduce practical reforms. They were a platform for agitation, for encouraging struggle, and for issuing bold socialist propaganda. After the election, Connolly explained his decision to stand as a socialist rather than an ILP candidate as follows. The return of a socialist candidate does not mean the immediate realisation of even the programmes of palliatives commonly set before the electors. Nay, such programs are in themselves a mere secondary consideration of little weight indeed, apart from the spirit in which they will be interpreted. The election of a socialist to any public body is only valuable insofar as it is the return of a disturber of the political peace." End of quote. He didn't win the election, but he worked tirelessly in building the SSF and later the Social Democratic Federation in Edinburgh. He even invited Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx and brilliant social activist in her own right, to speak at an SDF rally in Edinburgh that was attended by as many as 1,500 people. Eventually, however, Connolly was run out of his job at the Edinburgh Corporation for his radical political beliefs, and he took a position as the full-time secretary of the Dublin Socialist Club, which paid £1 a week. He wasted no time at all in reorganising the club, which had only 8 paid-up members. As soon as he arrived, he disbanded it and reformed it as the Irish Socialist Republican Party. Within 2 years, the ISRP had 50 members, and by 1899, Connolly was producing a newspaper titled The Workers' Republic, the first Marxist newspaper in Ireland. In the summer, Connolly held a series of outdoor public meetings, and attendance to some events was as high as 200 people. Although the ISRP performed relatively poorly when it stood candidates for elections, some of its members held key roles in trade union organisations. However, Connolly's time in Edinburgh had taken its toll on him, and the ISRP frequently took the position of simply propagandising when workers went on strike. In 1899 he wrote, quote, "At the ballot box, the master would only count as one against the workers. Their force could, if properly used, ensure the triumph of labour, as certainly as on the industrial plane, the power of the master's purse will nearly always win." End of quote. It wasn't until he went to America that this was to change. In 1897, a commemoration movement began gaining support to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the rebellion of Wolfe Tone and the United Irishmen in 1798. 98 commemoration committees began springing up, and they were mainly of a Republican but not socialist nature. Connolly and the ISRP worked tirelessly in organising for the commemoration, and when it was announced that Queen Victoria would be visiting Dublin in June to celebrate her Diamond Jubilee, Connolly wanted to involve the 98 Committee in an anti-Jubilee protest. The 98 committees refused to take part in a mass demonstration, instead deciding to hold the convention of the Commemoration Committee on the Jubilee Day. The ISRP pressed ahead anyway and organised a march following a cart carrying a symbolic coffin. As soon as the demonstration reached O'Connell Bridge, the police set upon them with batons. Connolly called for the coffin to be thrown over the bridge and dumped into the River Liffey as the crowd chanted, "Here goes the coffin of the British Empire." Connolly was briefly arrested for his part in the demonstration, and a wave of riots occurred over the following days as police treated demonstrators with increasing violence. Sensing that the commemoration committees were gaining momentum, the faction of Home Rule MPs began to co-opt the movement. In the end, it became welcoming to such reactionary figures that Connolly called it, quote, "a mockery of the revolutionary non-sectarianism of the United Irishmen." End of quote. In 1899, a very similar situation played out when protest movements sprang up to oppose the British war in South Africa, known as the Boer War. I won't go into too much detail here, but again, what started out as a movement of radical, revolution-minded Republicans was co-opted by liberal and reformist groups. After that blow, Connolly briefly toured Scotland and tried to bring together the revolutionary elements still left inside the SDF, which by this time had become extremely reactionary to the point of printing anti-Semitic attacks in its party newspaper. In 1903, the left was finally expelled from the party, and after becoming increasingly exhausted by the political situation, Connolly made the decision to emigrate to the US. Connolly's time in the US involved a great deal of complicated politicking and factionalism, which it would take far too long to get into here, but I will obviously try and give a brief summary. He was a member of the Socialist Labour Party of America, then the Socialist Party of America, and then the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW. He also founded the Irish Socialist Federation in New York. Broadly speaking, Connolly became involved with the IWW in its infancy, when it was extremely dynamic and full of revolutionary energy. Their ability to fight and win strikes was obviously extremely influential on Connolly's political thinking. He held a post as organiser for the IWW for a time, and his work in this period is distinctly syndicalist. Connolly was also publishing a newspaper called The Harp at this time, which served as the mouthpiece for the Irish Socialist Federation. In 1910, Connolly finally returned to Ireland. In that same year, he published Labour in Irish History. Very soon after arriving in Ireland, he went to visit Jim Larkin, the founder of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Larkin was in prison at the time, and after his release, he and Connolly became close. Connolly moved to Belfast and was appointed the Ulster District Organiser for the ITGWU. He led and won a number of strikes and founded the non-sectarian Labour Band. In 1913, an industrial dispute was to arise, which was to be one of the most significant in history. 60 workers were sacked from the Irish Independent newspaper for refusing to renounce their membership of the ITGWU, and the Dublin newsboys refused to sell the paper. Tram workers also refused to carry the paper, and some of them were laid off, which led to a complete strike among tram workers. This led to what is called the Dublin Lockout, which lasted until 1914. Employers in Dublin locked out their workers and employed scabs from Britain and other parts of Ireland. The Dublin Metropolitan Police became increasingly violent towards striking workers, and on the 31st of August 1913, they attacked a meeting on O'Connell Street, causing the death of 2 people and injuring nearly 300 more. Eventually, the Irish Citizen Army was formed by Larkin, Connolly, and an ex-British Army captain called Jack White to protect striking workers. Although the ITGWU lost the dispute, the creation of the Irish Citizen Army was going to prove to be a hugely important force in the fight for an Irish Republic. During this period, the Irish Volunteers, a separate military organisation founded by nationalists, was formed. The Volunteers were a larger group, and eventually they managed to secure rifles from Europe. Then the Second World War broke out, and Connolly, like Lenin and many other socialists, opposed the war, and was bitterly disappointed when the Second International fell apart. The Irish Volunteers were also divided, with a large number of them joining the British Army to fight in the war. Eventually, a group known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood were able to secretly gain control of the Irish Volunteers and began laying clandestine plans for an uprising. Connolly, however, didn't know this and believed them to be wasting time. He threatened to have an uprising with the ICA alone. This alarmed the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and the leaders of the IRB met with Connolly to try and reach an agreement. The story is often told that they kidnapped Connolly, but that's a somewhat disputed story. But they did meet and discuss the plans for an uprising. It was agreed that the ICA and the Irish Volunteers would set out to act together at Easter that same year in 1916. Connolly was the commander of the Dublin Brigade, which, as it had the most substantial role in the rising, made him the de facto commander-in-chief. On the morning of Monday, the 24th of April, around 1,200 members of the Irish Volunteers, ICA, and the all-women group Come Na Man mustered at several locations in Dublin. Connolly commanded a group that marched from Liberty Hall to the General Post Office, or the GPO. They occupied the building and hoisted 2 Republican flags. Patrick Pearse stood outside and read the proclamation of the Irish Republic. The next 6 days saw brutal fighting, and the British Army used military weapons and fired shrapnel and other types of artillery in a heavily populated city. 260 civilians were killed and over 2,000 were wounded. Connolly was badly wounded in the fighting, and after the ICA and Irish Volunteers surrendered, he had to be carried out on a stretcher. Despite being practically at death's door anyway, Connolly, along with 15 others, was sentenced to death. He was held in an apartment in Dublin Castle that had been converted to a first aid station. His wife and daughter visited him there, and he reportedly said to them, "The Socialists will not understand why I am here. They forget that I am an Irishman." These 2 sentences really sum up Connolly's political beliefs at this point, and he could be seen as a real pioneer of a kind of national liberation philosophy. On the 12th of May, 1916, he was taken in an ambulance to Kilmainham Jail. He was so badly wounded that he was carried into the courtyard on a stretcher and tied to a chair to face the firing squad. And so it was that his life was cut short at the age of 47 by the cruel and brutal hand of empire. Labour in Irish history represents the key vision of Connolly: to turn Irish nationalism away from the cause of bourgeois patriotism and towards the cause of international socialism. It is in this light that the work needs to be understood. It is primarily a manifesto aimed at Irish Republicans, like those he would ultimately end up fighting alongside in 1916. In the book, Connolly is mainly attacking two ideas. The first, the idea that in order to overthrow British rule in Ireland, a union of classes must be constructed. And the second, that a revolution in Ireland must follow the kind of mechanical stages approach advocated for by many in the Second International. In order to dispute the first point, Connolly provides many examples of the times uprisings against British rule were betrayed by Irish capitalists and landowners. He draws particular attention to the betrayal of the United Irishmen, and how their downfall was different to the downfall of Robert Emmet. To dispute the second point, Connolly refers to how little conflict there was between the English and Irish landowning and capitalist classes. The rich in Ireland were more terrified of a united peasantry than they were of English rule. He argues this point very successfully and puts forward a clear case against the efficacy of a revolution in Ireland led by the bourgeois classes. However, as Kieran Allen expertly illustrates in his book, The Politics of James Connolly, there is a confused second narrative that runs through the book. Quote, according to Connolly, at the heart of Irish nationalism was a different concept of property rights than that advocated under capitalism. The problem was that he assigned to these older traditions a contemporary political reality. Socialists had only to take over and develop a real Irish nationalism, which was instinctively against private property. To an extent, this reflected the desperately weak position in which Irish socialists found themselves in the 1890s. The working class had not yet entered the stage as a collective force. It was tiny and weak. Connolly's revolutionary impatience led him to seek other springs of revolt. This in turn led him to imagine a far greater radical potential within Irish nationalism than actually existed. His analysis was clearly wrong. In point of fact, Irish nationalism only arose because the clan system broke down completely, and a new class, the Irish bourgeoisie, arose. It was precisely the champions of private property who established Irish nationalism. There was nothing artificial about an Irish nationalist movement that accepted capitalist relationships. End of quote. Allen also highlights that one of the huge achievements of Labour in Irish history is its departure from the orthodoxy of the Second International, which I really wish I could take more time to get into in this overview, but it is quite complicated. Suffice it to say that at the time, there was such ideological strictness about the stages theory of Marxism that the working class of colonial countries was seen as victims that just had to wait and could have no power over their own destiny. Allen writes that, quote, instead of the colonial working class appearing as victims of oppression, they become the principal agents of liberation. Instead of having to await a revolutionary bourgeoisie, they have to replace them as leaders of the struggle for national independence. End of quote. I think this is incredibly important. At a time when the English Labour Party and other nominally socialist organisations in imperial core countries wanted the colonial working class to simply wait their turn, Connolly believed in the power of the masses to determine their own existence and change the world. Ultimately, when you're aware of what audience Connolly is writing for and the circumstances surrounding its publication, Labour in Irish history's flaws are vastly outweighed by its brilliant class analysis and its terrific oratorical writing style. If you're interested in learning a bit more about Connolly and the history of Irish independence and Irish socialist movements, I have a few book recommendations and a podcast recommendation. To start with, if you want a very in-depth and academic analysis of Connolly's political ideas and how they changed throughout his life, I cannot recommend The Politics of James Connolly by Kieran Allen enough. If you're after a more straightforward biography, there was a book series called 16 Lives produced in commemoration of the 16 men executed following the Easter Rising. The one on Connolly, simply titled James Connolly, 16 Lives by Lorcan Collins, is a very easy and compelling read. Lorcan Collins also has a podcast called Revolutionary Ireland, and he did a 2-part overview of the life of James Connolly, which is really, really, really brilliant. It's very easy listening, he explains everything in a very straightforward way and makes a very compelling narrative, much better than I've managed to do here. I'll make sure to link the podcast in the description. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this overview and felt that it was a useful introduction to the book. If you've got any recommendations about any improvements I can make next time I do one of these, then please drop a comment below. Thank you very much. Bye!